The brain and the way we think, it's precious. It's such a delicate process that makes us live, be human, to feel, to understand, to interact, to love, and to feel pain. A young girl, looking to be 7 years old, hopped into a county welfare office in Los Angeles. She walked like a rabbit, her hands held up high. Transfixed by this girl, the welfare officers thought she had autism. They couldn't take her eyes off her. 2 complete sets of teeth, wearing a diaper, spitting on the floor. They were looking at her further. And when this case was too distressing for them, when this case was found by authorities, when this girl was finally discovered by the world, this was possibly the worst example of the cruelest case of child abuse the Americas has ever known. Susan Wiley was born in 1957 to a tortured and blind mother and a delusional and sadistic father. But she wasn't their first child. Susan would have had 3 other siblings beforehand. One brother survived their father, one died from a birth defect, whilst her sister, well, she was left to freeze to death in the garage. Her father, he worked in a plane factory, and for someone who worked with all these machines and the deafening noises, he hated any noise. No television, no radio, not even speaking in the household. And well, that would lead to the worst beatings that any of these people would have in their entire life. Speaking alone. And when Susan's sister wouldn't stop crying, it drove her father insane. And deeper into this insanity hole. So he killed her. Susan was living a happy life at first. Born healthy and developing well, even though her father and his distasteful loud children brutally beat and tried to fatally strangle her pregnant mother. Susan being quiet and healthy, her father took no notice. But after a hip problem meant that she was wearing a brace for the first few months she was alive, it stopped her to learn to walk. Her father thought she had learning difficulties. His solution? He hated noises, so no one should talk to her. Lisa get beat up by his blunt weapons. 20 months old, Susan was living in the ostracized world of her delusional father, but that world was only going to be set ablaze. Her 6-year-old brother, walking his grandmother, his father's mother. And then, the first flame in this hell was set alight. His grandmother was killed, a drunk driver. And the drunk driver's lawful punishment? A probationary sentence. Grief, delusion, paranoia. They were all on a cataclysmic scale for her father. Her father was beyond heart-stricken of his mother's death. Her father blamed his son for his mother's death. Her father became paralyzed that the world was against him. His solution? He moved his family to his mother's house. He forbade his wife from visiting her friends or parents, and only allowed his son to leave house for school. Sitting with a shotgun in his lap, jobless and paranoid. His son, the face whom he knows and has abused so much, he had to prove himself with a world of ID before being let back inside the house. All this paranoia. And what of Susan? The family was only allowed to live in the living room, sleeping and living there. Susan, she was left in a small, dark, isolated room. She spent most of every day there, strapped by a belt to either a makeshift toilet with a nappy, or she was held tight in a straitjacket, all made by her father. No one was allowed to see her. only her brother to feed her and forcefully abuse her, or her father to play as a growling guard dog with his nails growing to scratch her and fists to beat her. This was a sickening way to self-justify that he indeed was a guardian and the guard dog of this house. Childhood stolen, freedoms absolved, terror that never ended. Her brother ran away from house at the age of 18. Her mother was almost entirely blind by the time Susan was 14. After an almost fatal argument, her father allowed her mother to gain access to blind financial benefits, taking Susan with her for the walk, their flesh and bones finally being subject to sunlight. 1970. The wrong turn takes place. Her mother walks into the welfare office. Susan, finally found, but not rescued. Researchers turned more ape than human, less human than the Suzanne and her lack of life that she had. They treated her as a miracle subject for them to understand the impacts of abuse on the brain and the development of one's abilities. They called her Genie, as she was freed from the lantern that she was captive in. But the reality was, she was still stuck inside of it. Her world is only collapsing. When they found her, she was almost mute, only saying sorry. But they found that she was able to say other words when she opened up to them. Her eyes could not focus on anything further than 3 meters, because that was the size of the room that she was held captive in for most of her life. Although she learned new words, she couldn't form sentences. Her grammar was not there. Scientists concluded that past the age of 10, well, it's too late for the brain to learn grammar. The enthusiasm of the scientists slowly died down. Feuds and internal drama led to the research falling apart. And with the world moving on with other events, and Genie not progressing much, she was forgotten. She was left in limbo, drifting between foster homes, facing other abuse. Jean Butler, a language teacher, she contested for Susan's mother to be her primary carer. In 1971, professionals were against this, but after claiming that Jean caught rubella, she was able to get Suzanne to quarantine with her. But that situation of quarantine only turned more permanent. Jean claimed that Suzanne was being abused by the other scientists and that she was her guardian angel. She was the only one who cared for her as a human being. The truth could not be any further. Jean exploited Suzanne for her own gain to fame. Suzanne was removed from her care, and in 1975, Suzanne's mother was the next person to offer her a home. But Suzanne was too much for her to handle. Another limbo of care homes that has started again. Eventually, she was sent to live in a children's hospital. A hospital her mother would later sue in 1979 and swear off any further testing on her child. Only one person truly challenged themselves to better Suzanne. Again, not for themselves, but for Genie. Suzanne Curtis was an American linguist. Her work improved the speaking abilities of Genie significantly, but only for them to be brought back to absolute zero as Genie was brought to the care of more foster homes, more abuse and neglect, her world that she never left. Till this day, Susan cares for Susan, Genie. Genie was institutionalized in the late 70s, and Susan has always tried to contact her. She says she's still alive, because each time she's called, they told her she's doing well. But they never let her have contact with her. She's become powerless in their attempts to visit her or even to write to her. The last contact Susan had with Susan, the early 80s. I've spent the last 20 years looking for her. I can get as far as a social worker in charge of her case, but I can't get any further. Susan's testimony for her quest for Genie. Genie's father killed himself shortly before being brought in front of the court. He stated the world would never understand him. Her brother, he faced a life that was plagued and mirrored the life that he desperately ran away from. Her mother, stuck in an underworld trying to help herself and her daughter do the best she can. And Genie, now 65, remains in a mental institution where not much is known about how she is or how she's developed. In a world that has never left her, she is still left coldly and solemnly isolated.